Hi, in this video I want to talk about intersubjectivity, might makes right, power makes right, the majority makes right, mob mentality, culture, tradition, and the aberrant cultures and traditions, and how obviously since most cultures and traditions believe a certain thing, or countries, nations, states believe a certain thing doesn't necessarily mean it's right. Like, sort of like Christianity, believing that Christianity is right because most people believe it doesn't mean it's right. That just means most people believe it, being fooled by a system of self-perpetuating reinforcement based off of majority constantly getting bigger. Sort of like the bigger it is, the more likely it's going to multiply quicker and over. So, like getting 2 to 4, then 4 to 8. It's sort of like getting from 2,000 to 4,000, 4,000 to 8,000 on a much larger scale. This reinforcement of the mob mentality, how one leader, reinforcement through leaders, and leadership, how people take the word from leadership and then they just sort of reciprocate, reinforce that, even if they don't necessarily know what they're talking about, and reinforce it, becoming part of the majority, even though the majority that they're a part of is a majority that doesn't necessarily believe or know exactly what they're talking about other than taking the word, sort of like the sheeple people, and the idea of the Borg mentality of understanding, not necessarily understanding, and just taking the word for being exposed to all sorts of kinds of things, and just taking the thing that seems the most right based on what most people think, and so on and so forth. This intersubjectivity thing is basically an idea that, since most people, I guess from what I understand, I haven't really looked at the word much, but from my understanding of the word, it's about people's agreements and creating a standard based on these agreements, based on a certain situation, and in creating a fact or some kind of fact and what's right and what's wrong based on the circumstances of what the majority believe. This intersubjective agreement and understanding between people, and understanding what situations are right and wrong based on the majority. Say the majority vote on some kind of thing where it's all of a sudden legal to start stoning people in the street for doing wrongdoings against the Judeo-Christian beliefs in the Bible, and so on, and things like that. Why would that be? And then obviously, since most people believe it, all of a sudden it's become a standard. It's an intersubjective agreement, an intersubjective standard for which society and the majority, at least for the majority on planet Earth, or in a country or a nation state, would all of a sudden agree and think that's right, and all of a sudden it is right, because sort of like being raped is right. All of a sudden rape would be right because most people would agree, or it's just a nasty social standard that that's frowned upon, as opposed to being illegal, when it's not necessarily a case, because only if a cop comes and arrests you will you consider it as something wrongdoing and sort of repent for your sins or for your wrongdoing. Obviously, you don't need that. It's obviously something that we all understand is morally or ethically wrong, and then we come to an agreement and understanding of the biology, the ethics, in which understanding that what you do something, sort of like the golden rule in the Bible, you do unto others as you want done unto yourself. And obviously, just because one or two people obviously would consider the aberrant would necessarily agree. Obviously, the aberrant can be right or wrong. If the few like to be raped or like to be this, doesn't mean the rest of them like to be raped. Considering any kind of risk and imposition, and the risk of that imposition, you should not risk or impose. Obviously, that's part of the game that we're playing. We can't do anything but impose. We're part of this constant movement game, and we can't do anything but impose, but we should try our best to mitigate against that imposition that we're doing, the basic imposition of life in the game that we're playing, and the imposition of having a conscious state of mind and awareness of what's going on around us, and understanding that we can't impose, at least an understanding, an awareness, a conscious awareness of the imposition that we're taking, and don't overtly impose when there's no consent and consideration, like having a child and things like that, against the rights of the kid, even though they don't exist, and they're going to turn into an adult someday, and they may regret the existence of the very fact that they exist, and things like that. So might makes right, things like that. There's good examples now of might makes right in individuals, countries, like in states now in the United States, especially nowadays, where obviously they have their different laws, state laws opposed to federal law. Obviously the federal law has power and jurisdiction over these state laws, but the state laws obviously work within a certain boundary, and recognition that obviously within the boundary of the state, but within boundaries of the federal law, and they can obviously work within and go through loopholes in the federal law, and creating individual state laws and sometimes based on that one state law, it can spread to other states and so on and so forth. Like the mob mentality, if a big popular state like Texas or something does something, all of a sudden it's going to start spreading to the rest of the country because Texas or California or New York or some kind of country state like that has more has more power, and it would spread because it's sort of like the leader. These big states, these powerful states, these very populated states would spread. And based on the popularity of these states, the grandiosity of these states, and the laws that they pass, would certainly more likely spread over to these other states. And it almost be it a good law or a bad law or something like that, it would spread to the rest of throughout the rest of the country more than likely, because these, especially if all the big states and things like that would spread, and it would spread to the rest of the country, or other countries like Sudan or India or whatever country you can think of, or any of these countries that are having protests or anything like that. I mean, they're considering passing laws, and there's these countries like the Ukraine trying to pass law and trying to create a better democracy, becoming part of becoming more part of the present, moving and changing their their ideas and their mentalities towards certain subjects and politics, and moving towards maybe a more progressive kind of politics and democracy, and moving forward and becoming part of a more civilized society. And there's examples like that I wanted to give an example of, sort of like these countries that don't want to pass rights for certain individuals or certain groups of people, and sort of like the countries or states. Obviously states are a good example, but countries are doing the same thing. And the majority, the aberrant, believes the right thing, while the majority, sort of like Christianity for the entire world, is still a very popular idea. And there's still over 1 billion people believing in Christianity and believing in these Islam and things like that. And just because the majority thinks it's right doesn't mean it's objectively right. Obviously, they can think it's right intersubjectively and come to an agreement where they think that's right based on the human standard of subjectivity, based on opinion, based on biases, based on circumstance, which created based on this objective standard that we've created. Sort of like, you can believe whatever you want, but that doesn't mean what you believe is true, and the objective truth is obviously there no matter what. Sort of like, you can believe that that something's blue when it's red, but it's still red no matter what. Even though on a photonic level or on an atomic level, where we're seeing things based on a human perspective, looking at things based on the light reflecting off of different surfaces, we can obviously see that it's a red light, not a blue light. And just because, based on the standards of recognition, even though I call red red and you call blue red, and your blue is a red, doesn't mean that the red that I'm looking at isn't reflecting a red light based on the standards. It is the red, the aura of red, the very fact that the color exists is still the fact that the color exists, and just because you call it something differently doesn't mean it's a different color. Your blue, red, the word that you call it, obviously, sort of like the pain someone experiences, doesn't mean that your pain, just because you're pain and you have a different threshold and something hurts you differently, doesn't mean that the suffering, and that you're not experiencing some kind of suffering or something like that. You're still experiencing something. I guess that wasn't the best example to use, but it's about the suffering. It's about the thing in reality that exists. It's the suffering that matters, not what makes you suffering, not what you subjectively call something. Just because you call red blue and I call red red, based on the color, the very fact that we have a foundation for understanding that is that the color exists in reality. Whatever we're considering exists in this reality, based regardless of what we want to consider talking about it, regardless of what causes the pain that you experience. Doesn't mean it doesn't matter. It's the suffering, the pain that matters, and the pain that matters that you experience, and not the thing that causes the pain. We can all understand pain, and it's about being pained or not being in pain, being comfortable or being in suffering or experiencing something like that. It's about being in a bad state of mind, being in a bad state, or being in a good, comfortable state of mind, or in a comfortable state in general. So we're experiencing these kinds of discrepancies. Obviously, I don't know if most people necessarily believe that we're living in a subjective world. Subjective world, sort of like people that are most people are anti-natalists now, but they're not anti-natalists based on the philosophy of anti-natalism. They're anti-natalists based on the fact that they don't want to take responsibility for having children. And if anything, it's about the end goal. That matters in the end. And the end goal is not having children, reducing population, hopefully reducing population to the point to where it becomes more sustainable, to the point where we can consider an in-game possibility, consideration of having this game end as gracefully as possible. and most people are obviously producing an insufficient amount of kids, and so on and so forth. This is a video that's going in all sorts of directions, but it's mostly about this intersubjectivity thing. And since the aberrant, in some cases, obviously aberrant in certain places is the right and the wrong, and how you can consider this on a global scale based on all of these living creatures, the human species in particular, and creating these rights that we have, and considering what's right and wrong, and having this imposition on others based on what's right and wrong, the extent of our imposition based on what's right and wrong. And taking into consideration about these individual small levels can prove something on the greater scale, when considering the aberrant on a certain scale can become the majority on a different scale. And obviously that's where you consider this intersubjectivity comes into some kind of doesn't make sense on the scale on these individual small levels. Intersubjectivity doesn't exist. It exists as a concept in recognizing that people obviously have this mob mentality, creating a majority based on opinion, thinking something's right based on the majority believing something's right. But that you can prove this sort of subjectivity, intersubjectivity, based on these boundaries that we create, all these artificial boundaries, these states that we live in, these countries that we live in, these continents, and these all sorts of things like that. These things like that, and based on these little different groups and these different little democracies based out of all these different groups that we create. The aberrant in one state or the aberrant in one country can be the majority in another country, and so on and so forth. And you can consider on the grand scale and consider that this can't really necessarily be applied on the grand scale. It can be applied on the grand scale, but it can't be necessarily applied realistically in consideration of what the truth is, because we have to recognize that since it almost disproves this idea of intersubjectivity and how it shouldn't be applied to some kind of objective truth, applying to something of subjective truth. I don't know if it concedes an objective truth when considering intersubjectivity. I think it's like based on this intersubjectivity that we're experiencing, it creates an objective truth based on a majority of people believing a certain thing, and that creates the objective truth, and that's not the case. It's about recognition. There's something that's bad, there's something that's good. What does best for most people would be the most right thing, and even though we can't necessarily reach the best for all people, we can try our best to doing and knowing something on the scale of understanding what's right and wrong. We can know we're going towards more right than we are towards wrong. Obviously, we can't please everyone and make everything perfect, or considering a circumstance and making everything comfortable for everyone. And obviously there's going to be circumstances where obviously that's the game that we're playing, is creating this discomfort to create this comfort. And obviously there's nothing we can do about that, and that's the game of playing, this very foundation of the existence that we're living in. And that's why we have to recognize and how this intersubjectivity, objectivity is based on the reality that we live in, not based on the opinions of other people, based on the malice that other people have, based on the biases and the conditions and the circumstances that surround other people. It doesn't matter what their circumstances are. It matters what they're feeling, and their feelings are matter. But the thing that matters, the only thing that's worth anything in this is the value is in the feeling and the sentient state, the feeling state of the sentient being. And the only thing that has that really goes beyond that is this intelligence and recognition. And if we're not using this intelligence for the right reasons to make everything better for everyone, and helping create a better world or society, and then eventually leading to no society, no society, meaning, and when I say no society, I mean finally reaching an end game, and hoping that there's no more suffering. The less people, the less sentient beings, the less likely there's going to be room for suffering, the less you're going to impose on someone else, the less amount of people are. But that doesn't take away from the imposition game, and overall, based on these crude forces that we're experiencing, taking away that game, it doesn't take away that game, even if you do have only one person existing. So this game that we're playing, this intersubjective game that we're playing, intersubjectivity, doesn't create an objective truth. The objective truth exists in the objective truth outside of our projections of value based on this truth, our biases and things. The objective truth exists on outside, so like the color example, it's still a red color. The description I use, based on a common understanding that red is a color, and a certain color, a specific color, we can understand that. Just because you decide to call it blue, all of a sudden it's blue, or you experience some amnesia and it's blue, doesn't mean it's still not red. It's still not the exact same color it was. And the description, the word I use, doesn't mean anything. So intersubjectivity, obviously, based on aberrants, little cut off little pieces, you put into a small group, then you have all these different small groups that have different aberrant. The majority can be the aberrant in this group, and the aberrant in this group can be the majority in this group, and so on and so forth, in terms of different issues, and issues that you consider overall can prove enough on a grand scale and understanding. If you put all these groups into one big group, that you can't necessarily apply the aberrant and understanding that these little groups have proven and then put in a big group. One, and then recognizing that this big group, on the smaller scale, recognizing splitting it up can make you recognize that no matter what the end outcome is, no matter how many people believe this or how many people believe that, based on their own circumstances, it doesn't mean what's right. It doesn't prove what's right and what's wrong. But just because you are someone believes something wrong doesn't mean that you're and they think they're right doesn't mean that you're not right and they're not wrong, and so on and so forth. You both think you're right doesn't mean you're not wrong and they're not right, and so on and so forth, and vice versa. But this intersubjectivity thing doesn't exist based on our own subjective awareness of things and understanding of things and our circumstances and bias. But objectively speaking, it's something that exists outside of our projections of value and experiences, and the only thing that matters is our experiences in interacting with the outside world and how it affects us as sentient beings as a good or bad, as a good state or a bad state. And how the outside world, based on our projections of value and our experiences and the imposition based on the outside experiences, affects us. So this idea of intersubjectivity doesn't exist. It doesn't change the objective truth that we're existing in. It doesn't change the fact that if you affect and harm a sentient being, obviously these scales exist. The weight exists. These impositions exist no matter what, but there's nothing beyond a certain point. We can recognize what's right, but we can only have a reasonable expectation of how this effect and how much wrong that will create based on some good effect that we have. Even if we do something good, the intention doesn't matter, and it matters you obviously have an end effect on this world, and that's all that matters in the end. So we can understand circumstances, closed circumstances, that something's right, but the effect, irrelevant to the point I'm trying to make, doesn't mean anything. It's about the certain circumstances. We can understand something's right or wrong based on those individual circumstances and how it has an effect on an individual being, disregarding the circumstances and the cause and effect afterwards. So intersubjectivity doesn't change the fact of what really is happening, and it's how it affects all these sentient beings and how all these other sentient beings interact with these other sentient beings and how it has an effect in the imposition we have. So intersubjectivity doesn't exist. It's a concept that we can apply based on our own opinions and biases, mob mentality, and things like that, but something beyond that doesn't exist. It's not a reasonable thing to bring into this world in consideration with all these sentient beings experiencing something and how all this chaos can create, this chaos of belief and sort can create only a mess and not anything better than that. Okay, I've spewed on long enough. It was kind of babbly again, but I just wanted to make sure I got all the points out and as concise as I can be, so I appreciate it and thank you. Until next time, bye.